And now we reach the next philosopher in the progression. Heraclitus. Heraclitus. He is not a Milesian. He is a pre-Socratic who started his own school. And from the objectivist perspective, he is the first villain in the history of Western thought. He is also the first enduringly influential philosopher in that his particular views are still widespread today. Nobody today is a hydromonist. But there are all sorts of Heraclitians wandering around. Heraclitus flourished about 500 BC. We have about 130 fragments, and they are so obscure that even in the ancient world he had the nickname the Dark, because he was wont to deliver aphoristic, cryptic utterances without explanation, sort of oracular. Now, the essence of Heraclitus's views, on which I want to pause for a few minutes because of his importance, are an attack on what Aristotle later defined as the basic laws of logic. Now, obviously, he could not have attacked the laws of logic explicitly, because the laws of logic were not even known until the 4th century BC when Aristotle defined them. But in retrospect, we can say that the essence of what Heraclitus was getting at, and what all of his followers promptly made explicit, is an all-out attack on the law of identity and the law of contradiction. Now, I assume you're familiar with those laws from objectivist literature, so I'll just say them in a word and explain their nature and importance properly when we get to Aristotle. But in a word, the law of identity is the simple view that everything which is what it is. Everything which exists possesses a nature, possesses an identity. It is something and is nothing else. A is A. And the law of contradiction, a corollary of the law of identity, says, well, then if things are what they are, a thing is not what it isn't. Nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. If you are 6 feet tall, you're 6 feet tall. You can't also be not 6 feet tall. You might grow, but at a given time, you can only be 6 feet tall. You might cut off your legs, but at a given time, and so on and so on. Now, Aristotle claimed that these laws were the basis of all logical reasoning, the basis of science, the basis of sanity. And you would certainly, I think, have enough knowledge from objectivism to see why Aristotle would say that. Heraclitus's point is that these laws are out. As I say, not explicitly he didn't say that, but that's the meaning. Now, why? Well, he said, everybody is so interested in change. I propose to show that the phenomenon of change is incompatible with these laws of logic. Or put it another way, the phenomenon of change requires the existence of contradictions, requires things which are and are not at the same time. Well, if so, we'd like to know how. Now, I'll use the same example that I used of the match, and this time derive Heraclitus's conclusion from it. Again, obviously, he did not use this example. I'm going to put this match now through a process of change and ask you to observe it closely. And at a certain point, we'll see if we can show from Heraclitus's point of view why it ends up being contradictory. Now, I've just plucked this match. This is still the same match that I had a second ago. It's still the same match, right? I mean, I didn't take the original match and throw it away and substitute a new match. That would be substitution, but I didn't do that. I still have the same match. All right, this is still the same match. I'm now going to make it go through a process of change. Still the same. All right. Here's the process of change now. All right. Now, is this still the same match? Obviously, it is. Still the same match. I didn't substitute another one. But it obviously is not the same match because it has changed. The tip is now hot and it used to be cold, and it's now black and it used to be white, and so on and so on. Says Heraclitus, this match is therefore the same as it was at the beginning, and yet it has changed. It is not the same as it was at the beginning. At the same time, namely after the change, It is what it was, but it is not what it was. It is and is not. It's the same and not the same. It's A and not A at the same time, which is a contradiction. Now, could we give another example? Oh, yes. Heraclitus is going to give all sorts. For instance, take any one of you. Now, remember the little baby that was born 20, 40, whatever years ago? Are you the same as that little baby? The same entity? Well, obviously, yes, you are. I mean, we didn't take that little baby and grind him up in a meat grinder and bring in somebody new. You are it. We didn't substitute. You are the same. On the other hand, what in the world is the same about you? Now, as the Heraclitians will say, your mental content is certainly completely different. Your values, ideas, and so on. According to certain biologists, every cell in your body changes every 7 years, so there's nothing physically left the same. So you're completely different, mentally and physically, and yet you're obviously the same. You're the same, and you're not the same. You're A, and you're non-A. Now, if you wanted to apply it to Thales, the way Heraclitus himself seemed to argue is like this. Everything is water, Thales says. Well, okay. Then after a change, the water is still water. But since it's changed, it isn't water anymore. So it is and it isn't. In other words, we can generalize. Wherever there is change, at the end of the change, we have the same thing. That's involved in it being change rather than substitution. But wherever there is change, at the end of the change, we have a different thing, because that's inherent in it changing. Therefore, at the end of the change, we have the same and not the same thing, and therefore change necessarily involves a contradiction. But change is the most obvious fact there is. No one could possibly deny it. The only conclusion can be the world is riddled with contradictions. The world is filled with things which are and are not. In fact, we can put it even better. The world is filled with things which are and are not what they were and were not, and what they will and will not become. As one commentator summarizes Heraclitus' view, quote, reality's essential nature lies in being both the same as itself and different from itself. For in order to change, a thing must become different from itself. If it remains the same as itself, it hasn't changed. But also, after it has changed, it must still be the same thing. Otherwise, there has been no change, but simply the substitution of one object for another. A changing thing, then, is an identity of opposites. It both is and is not what it was and what it will be, unquote. Now, you may think that that is a primitive viewpoint. That is obviously got a flaw in it, even if you might not know right offhand what it is, but that there's something obviously wrong with it, and that surely no one, after the development of modern science and Aristotelian logic and so on, could ever have been taken in by that. So I'll take 1 minute out of our packed schedule to read you a quotation. Who said the following? Quote, the law of contradiction is afflicted with falsity. It says nothing can both be and not be, but anything that can change defies it. It can both be and not be with the utmost ease, unquote. Now that is not Heraclitus. That is F.C.S. Schiller, one of the leading American pragmatists who taught for many, many years in the 20th century at the University of Southern California. Or if you want another one, who said this, quote, life consists before all just in this, that a living creature is at each moment itself and yet something else. Life is therefore also a contradiction, present in processes, continually occurring and solving itself. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life also ceases and death steps in. Unquote. Pure Heraclitus applied to life. That's Friedrich Engels, the sidekick of Karl Marx. And what the Marxists made is essentially a three-step waltz out of Heraclitus' viewpoint. But we won't cover that in this course. Now, as to what is wrong with this, think about it. I'm going to leave it for Aristotle, who took care of it definitively. So if you don't figure out an answer to it by then, You'll be sure to get it then. Let's go on to Heraclitus' next point. Now, he took change very seriously. On to his second point. Everybody at this time, as you know, was looking for the world stuff, the one in the many. Heraclitus looked like everybody else. But he said, I couldn't find anything that was everywhere. Couldn't be water, because there are things which aren't water. And the same reasons it couldn't be earth, and it couldn't be air, and so on. There is, he said, only one thing that I can find everywhere, without any exception. And that is the process of change itself. Everything is changing. Slow or fast, but at least everything is changing. Therefore, he said, if we really want to know the key to reality, if we want the metaphysical phenomenon, of course he didn't use those words, the essence of reality is change. That is the metaphysical essence. Now, the word that he used is becoming, usually spelled with a capital B, becoming. Everything is becoming, changing, evolving, developing, in process. Now, since he made this metaphysical, it follows that it applied to everything, not just to sticks and stones, but sealing wax and kings and the whole works. And therefore, Heraclitus took the view that everything is changing in every respect, at every instant. Change governs everything. And therefore, nothing remains the same for 2 consecutive instants in any respect. Now, his famous sentence illustrating this is, you can't step into the same river twice, for fresh waters are always flowing in. Now, that for him is the paradigm, the example of reality. You try to put your foot in it the next time, it's different. It's changed, and everything is like that. Now, there are many obvious examples of change to which he could appeal: landslides, volcanoes, earthquakes, biological growth, the slow changes of erosion, and so on. But you might ask, well, what would a follower of Heraclitus do with such a thing as this lectern? Now, this seems the most peaceful, quiet, motionless, unchanging thing you could ask for. It just sits there. What's happening? Well, Heraclitus might personally have had a little difficulty with it, but his followers don't bat an eye when you give them an example of that sort, because they say, well, looked at from your crude human senses, it looks like it is motionless. But if you could see it as modern science reveals it to us, you would see that this table is a holocaust of activity. There's all sorts of subatomic particles busily racing off and onto it. All the boundary interchanges. And there are electric charges coursing through it, and energy pulsations and cosmic rays, and you can, get any cheap science fiction and put in whatever you want there. The idea being that actually this table is a whirl of activity, this lecture, and it simply is the crudeness of human senses that makes this activity undetectable to us. But that simply is the defect of our senses. We can therefore, however, confidently generalize and say that everything, even the most apparently stationary things, are constantly changing. Now, from this point, Heraclitus drew a momentously important consequence. He drew the consequence that there are no things at all. No entities. Now, an entity means essentially a thing. For example, a table, a person, a mountain, a cigarette, a plant. Now, to the normal person, it seems blatantly obvious that there are all kinds of things, all kinds of entities. But Heraclitus observed that if you accept his principle, that everything is changing in every respect at every instant, there are no entities. Now, how does this follow? Well, in essence, he says, try and find me an entity. In reality, remember, which is constantly changing. You point to this lectern and say, there it is. But you no sooner got the it out, the T is still being pronounced, and it's gone completely, the lectern. It's vanished in the flux. It's completely different from what it was. Nothing stands still for one instant. Therefore, try to find something and say, there's a thing, and you just get to the and the thing is gone. And therefore, Heraclitus summarized in two famous aphorisms, which are two of his fragments. Nothing is, everything is becoming, which is surely a paradoxical utterance. And the other famous one is panta re, in other words, everything flows and nothing abides. Everything flows and nothing abides. Now, some of you have heard me read from a commentator who actually makes this point clear. And this is the only time I've ever found this particular point made unequivocally clear. I want to take a moment to read you a fairly lengthy passage from one historian who outdid himself in the presentation of this point. And since it's a very important point, hear him on this point. He's a modern commentator summarizing Heraclitus' view. I could not equal this level of clarity on this point. Quote, all things flow. No man can ever step twice into the same river. How could he? The second time he tried to step, new waters would have flowed down from upstream. The waters would not be the same. Neither would the bed and the banks be the same, for the constant erosion would have changed them too. And if the river is the water, the bed and the banks, the river is not the same river. Strictly speaking, there is no river. When people talk about a river, they suppose that a name applies to something that will remain there for a time at least. But the river remains there no time at all. It has changed while you pronounce its name. There is no river. Worse yet, you cannot step into the same river twice because you are not there twice. You too change, and the person who stepped the first time no longer exists to step the second time. Persons do not exist. When anyone says that something exists, the meaning is that that something does not change, at least for a short time. An object that is real must be an object that stands still. Suppose a clever sculptor takes a lump of children's modeling clay and begins to work it rapidly. It shortly takes on the appearance of the child's teddy bear. And if the sculptor should stop, we could call it a teddy bear. But he doesn't stop. His nimble fingers keep working, and the momentary bear turns into a small statue of Zeus, only quickly to disappear into the form of the Empire State Building. Well, what is it, you ask? The answer is not that it's a bear, or a god, or a building. Under these circumstances, all we could say is that it's modeling clay. And we could call it clay because the clay remains the same throughout the changes. But if the clay itself never remained the same, if it changed from clay to wax to paper mache and so on and never stopped changing, we could call it nothing. Nothing. That is, it does not exist. It is unreal. Unquote. Nothing is, everything is becoming. Change is the world stuff. Now, this sort of philosophy is called a process philosophy because it holds that process, activity, motion, change is reality. Now, do not take this superficially to mean merely that he thinks a lot of things are happening in the world. That a lot of things are happening in the world is not a philosophic viewpoint. That is a Reader's Digest homily. The Heraclitean view is that all that exists is change. A stream of shifting, restless, transitory, seething, boiling, bubbling, melting, fusing, swirling activity, riddled with contradictions, as though the whole universe were plunged in a kind of cosmic mixmaster and just simply flowed in all directions. And of course didn't flow because, you know. Now, Heraclitus himself, apparently in an attempt to get a metaphor to capture this, picked on fire, because fire was the closest he seemed to be able to get to the idea of motion without an entity, you know, the tongue's leaping and darting, and yet there's nothing solid there to get a hold of. It seems to be like the visual embodiment of pure motion. And therefore, in that terminology, he said the world stuff is fire. But he did not mean by fire any kind of material substance, but rather sheer process or activity. Now, I may point out that Heraclitus had a follower, many, but one in the ancient world, named Cratylus, Cratylus. I didn't take down his dates, but he was a disciple of Heraclitus and a teacher of Plato, so he's between the two. And he drew a apparently perfectly obvious conclusion from this principle. He stopped talking on principle. He took the view that no one should ever speak, on the grounds that there is no way to give words meaning, because the only way you can give words meaning is by giving them a referent, and there's nothing for words to refer to. If you try to say lectern, by the time you say lec, it's gone. And therefore words are simply noise, and a respectable man does not utter noise. According to Aristotle, from whom we learn about this, Cratylus at a certain point in his conversion therefore stopped speaking and simply wagged his finger when he was hungry, presumably beckoning the non-Heraclitians to bring him food. Now, we will see Aristotle's answer to this point also when we get there. So much for Heraclitus's fragments dealing with metaphysics. And now, one last issue in connection with Heraclitus of an epistemological sort. He is the first man in the history of philosophy to regard the senses as invalid. The reason is very simple. By the evidence of our senses, it appears that there are permanent, motionless, unchanging things. And yet, he says, we know that that's not true. We know that everything is changing. And so we simply must say that our senses are deceptive. They're invalid. They are simply too gross to detect the degree of change that is actually taking place. Sometimes his followers say that the change which is taking place is analogous to letting water into a bathtub via one pipe and out via another at the same rate, so that an unwary spectator looking at the surface will say no change is taking place because, in fact, two opposite changes are taking place and canceling each other out. And sometimes they use other equally equivalent examples or caliber arguments to account for the appearance of permanence. But in any event, their viewpoint is we have shown by reason that reality is filled with nothing but change, and therefore we reject the senses. Therefore, an earth-shakingly important distinction is implicit in Heraclitus, the distinction between two realms, reality and appearance. Reality is that which really exists. In Heraclitus's view, it's a massive change. By the way, his reality is very often referred to as a Heraclitian flux, that being a way of describing nothing but change which is riddled with contradictions besides. So there's reality, and on the other hand, there's the world as it appears to us, the world that the Greeks call the world of appearance. Reality is known by reason. Reason apart from the senses, reason in contradiction to the senses. And the world of appearances is the world as given us by the deceptive senses. Now, this duality between reality and appearance and its corresponding epistemological duality of reason versus the senses runs all through Greek philosophy with one or two exceptions. And Heraclitus is the first in which you find it. Anyone who subscribes to this view and who says that reason is what we should follow, reason in this sense of the term, reason as opposed to the senses, is called philosophically a rationalist. And therefore Heraclitus can be regarded as the first Greek rationalist. Now, that's obviously not reason in any objectivist or Aristotelian sense of the term, but that's the way the terms are used. You will see that Plato, of course, is a rationalist in this sense also. Now, in order to be fully fair to the historical Heraclitus, I would like to point out that he himself believed, quite inconsistently with the rest of his philosophy, that change was actually orderly, lawful, intelligible. He was, in fact, one of the earliest formulators of the view that the events in the world occur according to law and can be understood by the human mind. He thought there was a law of change governing all the particular changes. Now, for his views on this question, I refer you to a history text. But he was, in this respect, and I say this out of fairness, a good rational Greek in this respect. The Greeks, almost without exception, and no matter how awful they became, always, almost without exception, had something good to say. It's only since Christianity took over that you have philosophers that are black from top to bottom. But the Greeks almost always have something good, and that's true even of Heraclitus. Unfortunately, the good element in him was not nearly as influential as his flux side. Now, I don't think I have to point out to you the prevalence of Heraclitianism today. Anybody who says it's a changing world and uses that in anything other than an utterly innocuous sense is a Heraclitian. Anybody who says there are no absolutes, everything is relative, is a full-fledged orthodox Heraclitian. Because absolute in such a context means invariant, unchanging in time or place, something which holds for all times and places. And of course, for Heraclitus, there is no such thing. There are no absolutes. If it's true today, it won't be true tomorrow, and so on. And of course, the same kind of relativism will be generated not only for knowledge in general, but for ethics and value theory in particular. There'll be no absolutes in ethics any more than in anything else, a viewpoint at which Heraclitus himself actually hinted, but simply hinted in one of his fragments, that ethical relativism is the conclusion to draw. If you ever found anybody who equates old-fashioned with false, that is Heraclitianism at work. The idea being, to take an example that I hear frequently, the American Constitution, for instance, must be wrong. Why? Well, it was formulated in the 18th century. So, well, now it's the 20th century. Period. Now, that argument is pure Heraclitus. If the person attempted to say, in the intervening years there have been changes and so on, well, that would be one thing. Specific changes that require a specific change. He'd be wrong, but at least that would be a different argument. But if he simply says, time has passed, and the 18th century can't be applicable in the 20th, why can't it? Because everything flows and nothing abides, and that is Heraclitus. Most skeptics base themselves partly on Heraclitus. How can you say that you know that such and such is really true? Maybe yesterday it was true, but how do you know about tomorrow? Everything changes. Everything is becoming. Dewey says at one point, John Dewey, that Aristotle's logic must be no good because it's worked for so long. You must need a new one. Now, as to what it would be like to live in the Heraclitian world, well, of course, physically you don't and you can't. But you can get a good taste of it, unless you're very fortunate, in your social existence. Because most people, to some extent, live in a Heraclitian world socially. A great many children live in that kind of world, thanks to the wanton irrationality of their parents, whose behavior is characterized by constant switching and swimming so that nothing ever holds true from one moment to the next, and by constant contradictions. That is the perfect recipe for the Heraclitian world. Most citizens, in relation to the government of a mixed economy, live in exactly that Heraclitian world. And if you want a kind of perfect example, most businessmen, in regard to the antitrust laws, live in an absolutely clear-cut textbook Heraclitian world. Because what are their complaints about the antitrust laws? One is, everything flows and nothing abides. Interpretations change from moment to moment and you never know what's coming next. And the other is, everything in that world is and isn't. Is competition good? Yes, of course, because monopoly is bad. Is competition good? No, of course, because the efficient will then take away the markets of the inefficient. It is and it isn't. Now that is Heraclitianism, and you see where it's getting us. If you want a marvelous portrayal of it, I remind you and suggest that you reread the scene in Atlas Shrugged between Cheryl and Dagny, where Cheryl comes at the climactic part in her relation with Taggart and is saying that everything is switching, everything is swimming, everything is changing, and she can't endure it or understand it. And Dagny says, tells her what she needs to know in essence, and tells her that there have been philosophers working for centuries to bring about just that state. Well, the first and most influential of the philosophers that she refers to in this scene is Heraclitus. Why did Heraclitus not say that the law of change was the world stuff rather than the change itself? Well, first of all, he did not have a very clear idea of what the law of change consisted of. It was pretty much to the effect that there has to be a balance, and change in one direction in the so-called upward way has to balance change in another direction, the downward way. But I think the main point is that the law of change is simply a description of how change operates, and consequently is not something apart from change, although I grant you that according to some commentators, the law of change is reified by Heraclitus into an entity distinct from change, and many people think that it is one of the sources of the Christian God too. So you can throw that in the pot along with Parmenidean 1 if you want.